Thank you very much. It's great to be here for the Herald Tribune and for the New York Times, and thank you all for coming. I'm just going to take a half hour or so to talk to you about my latest book, which is not about the Middle East at all. It's about America. But I think, and I hope you'll find that in the challenges that I discuss that my own country is facing, they will resonate with challenges that you find here in Dubai and in the region as a whole, or your own home countries. The book is called That Used to Be Us: How America Lost Its Way in the World It Invented, and How We Can Come Back. Whenever we tell people the title of the book was co-authored with a friend of mine, Professor Michael Mandelbaum from Johns Hopkins University, Professor of International Relations. Whenever we tell people the title of the book, That Used to Be Us, their first question always is, but does it have a happy ending? And we tell everybody it does. We just don't know whether it's fiction or nonfiction. That depends on us and what we do. Now, you might wonder, how did two foreign policy geeks, I'm the foreign affairs columnist for the New York Times, you know, and my co-author, Professor Mandelbaum at Johns Hopkins, chaired professor of international relations there. How did two foreign policy geeks end up writing a book about America and American domestic politics? And the answer is very simple. We are old friends. We are neighbors. We live next door to each other in Bethesda. We talk every morning, almost, much to the chagrin of our wives. And we started to notice something over the last 3-4 years, that we started every day talking about the world, as was always our habit. But over the last 3 or 4 years, we'd end every day talking about America. And it became apparent to us that America, its fate, future, vigor, and vitality, was really the biggest foreign policy issue in the world. Whether America can continue to provide global public goods, basically, whether it's stabilizing the sea lanes in Asia or driving global institutions like the IMF and the World Bank. We are, in a way, American nationalists. We believe America makes all kinds of mistakes in the world. But on balance, we think America is a hugely constructive force for the stability of the world system. And if America goes weak, your kids won't just grow up in a different Dubai. They won't just grow up in a different England. They won't just grow up in a different, America. They will grow up in a different world. And that really is the premise of this book. And therefore, whether my generation, the baby boomer generation, gets its act together to propel America forward so that we aren't the first generation of Americans who doesn't pass on the American dream to their kids, a rising standard of living, is, in our view, the biggest foreign policy issue in the world. Now, we are both movie buffs, and the book is built around a lot of movie themes. And there's one movie scene in particular that probably captures the deepest concern we have. It's from that 1958 Orson Welles classic, Touch of Evil, a movie you'll remember about murder, kidnapping, conspiracy, and corruption in a town on the Mexican-American border. Orson Welles plays a crooked cop who tries to frame his Mexican counterpart for a murder. At one point, Welles stumbles into a brothel and finds the proprietor, Marlene Dietrich, who is also a fortune teller, with cards spread out in front of her. "Read my future for me," Welles says. "You haven't got any," she replies. "Your future is all used up." Is that us? Is that America? Well, we don't think so. We certainly hope not. But we got to get our act together. It is not a certainty that we will pass on this American dream to another generation. Now, I know many of you have read the book. Those of you who haven't, I know who you are. I know who you are, and I know where you travel. But for those few of you who haven't and are about to download it on your Kindle as soon as I'm done speaking, I want to share with you the first few chapters of the book, which really frames the whole argument. This is how the book begins. The opening chapter is called, "If You See Something, Say Something." This is a book about America that begins in China. In September 2010, I attended the World Economic Forum Summer Conference in Tianjin, China. 5 years earlier, getting to Tianjin had involved a 3.5-hour car ride from Beijing to a polluted, crowded Chinese version of Detroit. But things had changed. Now, to get to Tianjin, you head to the Beijing South Railway Station, an ultra-modern flying saucer of a building with glass walls and an oval roof covered with 3,246 solar panels. You buy a ticket from an electronic kiosk offering choices in Chinese and English, and you board a world-class high-speed train that goes right to another roomy modern train station in downtown Tianjin. Said to be the fastest in the world when it began operating in 2008, the Chinese bullet train covers 115 kilometers in 29 minutes. The conference itself took place at the Tianjin Beijing Exhibition Center, a massive, beautifully appointed convention center, the likes of which exists in few American cities. As if the convention center wasn't impressive enough, though, the conference's co-sponsors in Tianjin gave some helpful facts and figures. They said the building contained a total floor area of 230,000 square meters, and that construction of the Beijing Convention Center started on September 15th, 2009, and was completed in May 2010. Reading that line, I started walking around my hotel room, September, October, November, December. That's 8.5 months. Returning home to Maryland from that trip, I was describing the Tianjin complex and how quickly it was built to my co-author, Michael, and his wife, Ann. At one point, Ann interrupted and said, "Excuse me, Tom, have you been to our subway stop lately?" Now, we all live in Bethesda, Maryland, and we use the Washington Metro Rail subway to get to work in downtown Washington every day. I had just been to the Bethesda station and knew exactly what Ann was talking about. The two short escalators had been under repair for 6 months. While the one being fixed was closed, the other had to be shut off and converted into a two-way staircase. At rush hour, this was creating a huge mess. Everyone trying to get on or off the platform had to squeeze single file up and down one frozen escalator. It sometimes took 10 minutes to get out of the station. A sign on the closed escalator said its repairs were part of a massive escalator modernization project. What was taking the modernization project so long? We investigated. Kathy Asado, a spokeswoman for Washington Metro, said that the repairs were scheduled to take about 6 months and are on schedule. Mechanics needed 10 to 12 weeks to fix each escalator. A simple comparison made a startling point. It took China's Teta Construction Group 32 weeks to build a world-class convention center from the ground up, including giant escalators in every corner, and it was taking Washington Metro 24 weeks to repair two tiny escalators of 21 steps each. We searched a little further and found that on November 14th, 2010, the Washington Post ran a letter to the editor from one Mark Thompson of Kensington, Maryland, who wrote, "As someone who has ridden Metro for more than 30 years, I can think of an easier way to assess the health of the escalators. For decades, they ran silently and efficiently, but over the past several years, when the escalators are running, aging or ill-fitting parts have generated horrific noises that sound to me like a Tyrannosaurus Rex trapped in a tar pit, screeching its dying screams." The quote we found most disturbing, though, came from Maryland Community News. It was about the long lines at rush hour caused by the seemingly endless metro repairs. It was from one Benjamin Ross, a frequent rider from Bethesda, who said, "My impression, standing on line there, is that people have sort of gotten used to it." People have sort of gotten used to it. Indeed, that sense of resignation, that sense that, well, this is just how things are in America today, that sense that America's best days are behind it and China's best days are ahead of it, have become the subject of water cooler, dinner party, grocery line, and classroom conversations all across America today. So do we buy the idea, increasingly popular, that Britain owned the 19th century, America dominated the 20th century, and China will inevitably reign supreme in the 21st century? No, we do not. And we've written this book to explain why no American, young or old, should resign himself or herself to that view either. The two of us are not pessimists about America's future. We are optimists, but we are also frustrated. We are two frustrated optimists. The title of this opening chapter is, "If you see something, say something." You know where that's from. That is the mantra of the Department of Homeland Security. It plays over and over on loudspeakers in airports and railway stations around America today. Well, we have seen and heard something, and millions of Americans have too. What we've seen is not a suspicious package left under a stairwell. What we've seen is hiding in plain sight. We've seen something that poses a greater threat to our national security and well-being than anything al-Qaeda does. We've seen a country with enormous potential falling into the worst sort of decline, a slow decline. Just slow enough for us not to drop everything and pull together to fix what needs fixing. This book is our way of saying something about what is wrong, why things have gone wrong, and what we can and must do to make them right. That's how the book opens. Can I ask you to do the pictures after? Yeah, thanks. Can we do that after? There'll be plenty of time. Thank you. So that's the general opening of the book, and the simple argument of the book, the opening half, is that America today faces three great challenges. The first is one I alluded to in my opening remarks here, how we respond to the huge development of the merger of globalization and the IT revolution, which we believe is a huge workplace challenge and therefore a huge education challenge. That's what I'm going to talk about here tonight. The other two challenges are debt and deficit, obvious how we manage this whole entitlement problem, and lastly, energy and climate, how we power rising middle classes, whether in Dubai, Detroit, or Brazil and Russia, without tipping our planet into dangerous climate change. Those are the three great challenges. Let's talk about the first, the merger of globalization and the IT revolution, which I believe is actually the underlying driver changing and explaining more things in the world today than anything else. The simple argument of this book is that the world over the last 6-7 years has gone from connected to hyper-connected, from what I would call flat world 1.0 to 2.0. And I know a little bit about this subject because in 2004 I sat down to write a book called The World is Flat, came out in 2005. And it was a book that argued that the world was getting connected. When I sat down to write this book, one of the first things I did was get the first edition of The World is Flat off the bookshelf. I cracked it open to the index, opened it up. In the index, A, B, C, D, E, F, A. Facebook wasn't in it. So when I was out there saying the world is flat, we're all connected, Facebook didn't exist. Twitter was still a sound. The cloud was still in the sky. 4G was a parking place. LinkedIn was a prison. Applications were what you sent to college. And for most people, Skype was a typo. All of that just happened. I love doing that. Can I do that again? Okay. All of that just happened in the last 6 years. And it has fundamentally taken the world from connected to hyper-connected. When I wrote The World is Flat, I said we'd connected Beijing, Bangalore, and Boston. We've now connected Beijing, Bangalore, Boston, and Surisi. Where's Surisi? That's a town 90 miles to the interior from Bangalore with 90,000 people, which, thanks to these web-enabled cell phones, is now on the grid with your kids in mind. When I wrote The World is Flat, I said we'd connected Detroit and Damascus. We've now connected Detroit, Damascus, and Dera. You say, where's Dera? Oh, Dera is the dusty Syrian border town on the Syrian-Jordanian border where the uprising began, which, thanks to these flip cams, cell phone cameras, and videos, we have managed to watch the Syrian uprising live over the last year, despite the fact that Syria has banned every international news organization from its territory, including CNN and Al Jazeera. We have been watching it all on a YouTube virtual channel called SNN, Sham News Network. Sham is Syrian and Arabic. I would bet the people at this table right here have in their wallets right now enough money to start Sham News Network. That is not a connected world. That's a hyper-connected world. Now, I see signs of this in a lot of other places. I like to connect little stories when I travel around the world. I love to read local papers. And I was in India in October 2010, October 30th. The Indian newspaper, the Hindustan Times, ran a news item reporting that a Nepali telecommunications firm had just started providing 3G mobile network service at the summit of Mount Everest, the world's tallest mountain. The story noted that this would allow, quote, thousands of climbers and trekkers who throng the region every year access to high-speed internet and video calls using their mobile phones. Do you know how many phone calls are now being made from the top of Mount Everest that begin, "Mom, you'll never guess where I'm calling you from"? That's not a connected world. That's a hyper-connected world. You see it in other ways, too. I'm from Minnesota. My wife is from Des Moines, Iowa. Iowa is a great Midwestern state. There's a wonderful liberal arts college in central Iowa called Grinnell College, 1,600 students, great gem of a liberal arts school. My mother-in-law went there, later became chairman of the board. Wonderful school. Last year, 9% of all applications to Grinnell College came from China. Of that 9%, 43% had perfect 800s on their math SATs. That's also part of the hyper-connected world. Someone here in Dubai wants their kid to go to Grinnell next year. God bless you. You will be competing in the last class with 255 applications from China, half of which had perfect 800s on your math SATs. Have a nice day. Okay? When I was a student undergrad at Brandeis, we had a Chinese exchange student, Zhao. He was great, taught everybody how to use chopsticks. Get that out of your head, okay? You want your kids now to go to a top flight college in America, you are not competing with students in Abu Dhabi, and you are not competing with students in Sharjah, and you are not competing with students just in Bahrain. You are competing with the best of the best from PS21 in Shanghai in this hyper-connected world. So what does all this mean? Well, again, I alluded to it a little bit. I think what it means is when the world gets this connected, the whole global curve rises. As if the world were one big math class, the whole global curve has risen because every employer today now has access to more cheap labor, cheap software, cheap automation, cheap robotics, and cheap genius than ever before. And that is a huge driver of change now in the workplace. There's a joke they say now about American factories, typical American factory. It just has two employees, a man and a dog. The man is there to feed the dog, and the dog is there to keep the man away from the machines. It's an exaggeration, but it's the direction things are going. Now, what does all this mean then? Well, what it means for the labor market is very simple. Again, as I alluded to, it means that average is really over. It means that everyone now has to bring some extra, some unique value add to justify their employment. That's why I tell my girls, I'm old fuddy-duddy. When I graduated from college, I got to find a job. You will have to invent a job. That's the big change. It may not be your first job, but to keep that job, you will have to invent, reinvent, and re-engineer yourself and that job. Because the pace of change is that quick. I was at an event in Dallas a few months back for AT&T, and they sat me next to a banker, and he said something that really stuck in my mind. He said, "Tom, today you only hire someone if you absolutely have to." That really is the mindset of every employer. Do I really have to hire someone? Can I do this with automation, with robotics, with software? Well, yes, I do have to hire them, but that person is going to have to justify their unique value add. I know what you're thinking. You're thinking very easy for you to say, Mr. Smarty Pants, New York Times columnist. No, let me tell you about my job. I inherited James Reston's office at the New York Times when I became a columnist. Great editor and columnist from the 60s and 70s. What an honor. I suspect Mr. Reston used to come to the office back in the 60s and 70s and say to himself every morning, I wonder what my 7 competitors are going to write today. And by the way, he knew all 7. Walter Lippmann, Mary McGrory, Stuart Alsop, Tony Lewis. I do the same thing. I come to the office every morning and I say, I wonder what my 70 million competitors are going to write today. I have 70 million competitors. Every blogger, everyone writing for The National, the Gulf News about the Middle East. Anyone can find them, compare them to my column or anybody else's now. I was in India last September, went out to IIT Jodhpur, Went out to IIT Jodhpur because IIT Jodhpur, one of their MITs, had won a competition run by the Indian Ministry of Education for who could invent an iPad that would sell for under $40. Okay? And IIT Jodhpur won. 2 electrical engineers there, one of whom I always love the fact, came from a village in India with no electricity. Now this is a stripped-down iPad. It has none of the beauty or functionality of the Apple iPad, but it's a great education tool, wireless device that sells in India for $39 with a little government subsidy. Amazing device. Came home and I wrote about it. I wrote about it as a Sunday column. My Sunday column in the New York Times moves at 8 p.m. East Coast time Saturday night. Sometime between 8 p.m. East Coast time Saturday night and 8 a.m. in New York, someone in India ran a lab stress test of this device and posted the results in the comments section right under my column. So before my readers in New York even read it, someone in India had run a lab stress test device. Fortunately, it backed up my excitement about the device and posted it on my column on NewYorkTimes.com right under the column. If you don't think that doesn't keep me on my toes, trying to figure out what my extra is, well, then you'd really be fooling yourselves. So what's going on in the labor market? Well, historically, the labor market's been segmented into 3 tiers. The top tier is called non-routine work. We all want to be non-routine workers. Scientists, engineers, lawyers, accountants, doctors, singers, writers, performers, athletes. We all want to do work that cannot be described by an algorithm and therefore easily outsourced, automated, or digitized. We all want to be non-routine. Next layer is called routine work. That's work that was done repetitively in a routine way, could easily be automated or described by an algorithm. Routine work has been crushed. That's all the backroom work in banks and so much assembly line work. Then there's non-routine local work. That's your butcher, your baker, your candlestick maker, your divorce lawyer, your nanny, your nurse. Jobs that have to be done face-to-face in a specific location. But the wages of non-routine local workers will depend really on the number of non-routine high-end workers you have in your community. It's much better today to be a masseuse in Silicon Valley or Cupertino next to Apple than it is in Detroit. Okay? So basically what's happened, though, in the hyper-connected world is really a change with non-routine work. It's no longer enough now to just say, I'm non-routine. Hey, I'm a non-routine radiologist. Good. I can now get my x-rays read in India very easily. What else can you do? It's not enough to just be non-routine. You got to be creative non-routine. Not enough just to be a non-routine columnist. You got to be bringing something extra all the time. It's not enough to say, you know, I'm just a lawyer. You got to be a creative lawyer now. Not enough to just say I'm an accountant. You got to be a creative accountant. Well, not a creative accountant, but you know what I'm saying. Okay, you've got to bring something extra to whatever you do. That is the big challenge. And I really came to understand this by really an inductive approach, just going out and interviewing employers and asking them, who are you looking for now? And it was very interesting. We profile 4 of them in the book. We profile a high-end white-collar employer. This is a national law firm, the head of their Washington office. We profile a low-end white-collar. This is head of the outsourcing firm, actually, in India, where I started. The world is flat. We interview a big blue-collar firm, Ellen Kullman, the CEO of DuPont. And we interviewed the head of the world's biggest green-collar firm, the head of the U.S. Army Education Corps. And what's really interesting, when you talk to these 4, they're all looking for the same employee. They're looking for employees who can do critical thinking, reasoning, and problem solving, ... in order to get an interview. Yeah, critical reasoning and problem solving is really table stakes now. What they're all really looking for are people who do critical reasoning, thinking, and problem solving, and invent, reinvent, and re-engineer their jobs while they are doing it. You have companies now like Zynga, the gaming company. Zynga reviews its team leaders every quarter. Why? Because if you have 4 or 5 product cycles in 1 year, as the gaming industry does, if you have a bad team leader, you cannot wait 365 days to figure out you have a bad team leader. You will be 4 or 5 product cycles already in to your year. Zynga, that's extreme edge, but that is the cutting edge of where this is going. So it's very interesting. The head of that white-collar firm, head of a big Washington law firm, his name is Jeff Lesk, happens to be a family friend. This all started in 2008. Lehman Brothers had just melted down, and we were having dinner with Jeff and his wife, my wife and I. And I said to him in passing, Jeff, boy, what's happened to your law firm? He said, business way off. I said, well, what are you doing about it? He said, we're laying off lawyers. I said, well, that's interesting. In a law firm, who gets laid off first? Is it last in, first out? He said, well, it used to be, but it isn't anymore. Now, you see, the people are getting laid off are when we were in the bubble and we had all this work and we handed it to non-routine lawyers and they did it in a routine, non-routine way and handed it back. A lot of them, they're gone. The ones we're keeping are those who came to us and said, Jeff, we could do this old work in a new way, or we could do new work in a totally new way. His interview in the book ends with him announcing that his law firm has just hired a chief innovation officer. How many law firms have you heard of having a chief innovation officer? But that's where this is going. The head of the green-collar firm was really interesting. His name is General Martin Dempsey. You may have heard of him. He's actually now the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, our senior military officer. But when we interviewed him, he was head of the U.S. Army Education Corps. But what makes General Dempsey most interesting is he was the general who commanded the 1st Armored Division that took Baghdad from Saddam Hussein in 2003. 5 years later, in 2008, he was commander of CENTCOM, the overall Middle East military command of the United States. In that job, he visited Afghanistan. He went to a far-flung base out near the Hindu Kush, commanded by a U.S. Army captain. He tells this story in the book. He spent 2 hours with that captain. He walked out and realized that that captain, out there near the Hindu Kush, had access, in a hyper-connected world, to more intelligence at both the tactical and national level, and could order up more firepower than he, General Martin Dempsey, could 5 years earlier when he took Baghdad from Saddam Hussein in 2003. So he went home and completely revamped the U.S. Army education curriculum, including, in some cases, giving new recruits at boot camp an iPhone when they arrive. By week 3, you will be invited to download the lesson. The drill instructor will sit in the first row, and you will teach the class. The whole idea is when a forward commander becomes that empowered and that informed, how you choose that commander and how you promote that commander and what you look for in that commander becomes fundamentally different. This is what's going on all through the labor market and why we say that average is officially over. That old saying in Texas, if all you ever do is all you've ever done, all you'll ever get is all you ever got, is no longer applicable. If all you ever do is all you've ever done, all you'll ever get is no longer what you ever got. You will get less. Woody Allen's dictum that 90% of life is just showing up, also N.A., no longer applicable. If you just show up to your job, you will not earn an average wage. I live in Bethesda, Maryland, 45 minutes down the road from Baltimore. 50 years ago, the biggest employer in Baltimore was Bethlehem Steel Company. You could drop out of high school, join the steel union, get a job at the steel plant, join the union, earn a very decent wage, enough to get a mortgage, buy a house, a yard, 2 kids and a dog, work 30 years, retire, go to Orioles games. Life was good. You were part of the great American middle class. Today, the biggest employer in Baltimore is Johns Hopkins University Medical Center. Bethlehem Steel is no more. They do not let you cut the grass at Johns Hopkins without a BA. That is the fundamental inflection point. So what do we tell our kids? Well, all I can tell you is what I tell my girls. First, think like an immigrant. Second, think like an artisan. Third, think like a starter-upper. And fourth, think like a waitress at Perkins Pancake House in Minneapolis, my favorite restaurant. What do I mean? First, think like an immigrant. How does the immigrant think? The immigrant thinks, I just showed up here in Dubai, and there is no legacy spot waiting for me at the University of Dubai or Abu Dhabi. I better figure out what's going on here, see where the opportunities are, and pursue them with more energy and vigor than anybody else. Immigrants are paranoid optimists. They're optimists because they pick up from somewhere and go somewhere else. And they are always paranoid that it can be taken away from them in a second. We are all new immigrants to the hyper-connected world. Stay hungry, okay? Second, think like an artisan. Who is the artisan? This is an idea from Larry Katz at Harvard. Artisan was that person in the Middle Ages before mass manufacturing and before assembly lines. The artisans were those people who made every item one-off. They made every pair of shoes, every utensil, every item of clothing, every saddle, every boot. Every one they made individually. And what did the best artisans do? They took such pride in their work, they brought so much extra, they carved their initials into their work. Do your job every day as if you brought so much extra to it, you would want to carve your initials into it. Third, think like a starter-upper. This is an idea from Reid Hoffman, the founder of LinkedIn. Reid always likes to say, in Silicon Valley, there's only one four-letter word, and it's not the one you think. And it isn't even 4 letters. It's finished. If you ever think you're finished in what you're doing as a person or in a product, that's when you are truly finished. Always be in beta. Always be as a person in that mindset of a product, a piece of software that isn't quite finished, but they throw it over the wall, let the community mess with it, find the mistakes, bring it back, perfect it, throw it over the wall again. Always be in beta. Always be engineering and re-engineering yourself. Finished is a 4-letter word in a hyper-connected world. Lastly, think like a waitress at Perkins Pancake House, my favorite restaurant. I was out in Minneapolis while I was working on this book, had breakfast with my best friend Ken Greer on a Sunday morning at Perkins at 7 a.m. I ordered 3 buttermilk pancakes and scrambled eggs. Ken ordered 3 buttermilk pancakes and fruit. And after 15 minutes, the waitress came, laid our 2 plates down, and all she said to Ken was, "I gave you extra fruit." She got a 50% tip. Because that waitress did not control much, but she controlled the fruit ladle. She controlled the fruit ladle, and that was her extra. What was she doing in her own little world? She was thinking entrepreneurially. Always think entrepreneurially in everything you do. So mom and dad to the kids, think like a new immigrant, always be hungry. Think like an artisan, always take pride. Think like a starter-upper and always be in beta. And think like a waitress at Perkins Pancake House and always think entrepreneurially. Because we now all live in Garrison Keillor's Lake Wobegon, where all the men are strong, all the women are beautiful, and all the children need to be above average. Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you. So I guess we have time for a few questions, boss. Is that right? Yeah, please, people just stand up and I can repeat the questions. I guess there's a microphone there.
Not unexpectedly, it's a very enjoyable presentation.
Thank you.
I send your articles to my kids too, because I think that the lesson you teach is worth them hearing. But my question really is about the world as a whole. I think the prescription that you have outlined is one that the talented among us, can hear and act on. But the reality is that the world as a whole consists of people who are average and are below average and are above average but not necessarily able to implement recommendations. So I asked myself, what kind of world do you see us living in? I don't even see it as a barbell, because there'll be a small top of all the people who can do what you said, and there'll be a massive, massive bottom, and the middle class that I think is a fulcrum of or a basis for the stable, healthy, democratic societies. I don't really see how it fits into your vision. And one final comment, as far as
Please.
the waitress in Minneapolis is concerned, the fact that she gave 50% more fruit, her employers, if she does that for everybody, would probably look askance on that.
Maybe not. Maybe we would come back more often.
Maybe they would. But
Yeah,
the question is.
Yeah. No, I think you're asking a very
in world where
profound.
Not everybody is as.
Yeah.
Can
You're asking a really
develop,
profound and important
how do you see
question,
it evolve?
and believe me, we've thought about this. And first of all, I will plead ignorance. I don't know. I see the trend more than I see the solution. I see the train coming at me, okay, more than I understand the solution. Because a lot of this was, I say, it's just done inductively. You go out, you talk to people, you see what's happening. But let me just say a couple things, three things. One is that I believe everyone's really above average at something. And part of it is finding what that is. And you can be above average in a lot of different ways. You can be the person behind the counter at a wine store who really learns about wine. You can be the person in a nursing home taking care of the elderly who actually doesn't just show up but puts a smile on their face. And I had a mother in a nursing home for 10 years with Alzheimer's. How much more I would pay for a caring male or female nurse who put a smile on my mom's face. I'd double their wages tomorrow. So there's a lot more ways to bring extra than people sometimes realize, and to find your extra in a lot of different occupations. So that's one challenge we face. I think the second challenge we face is, and this is where our own debate in America, I think, has really gotten off track. Where do jobs come from? Okay. To have employees, you need employers. Okay. To have employers, you need people to start companies that make people's lives more productive, more comfortable, more entertained, more educated, or more secure. That's basically it. You're one of those 5 categories. We've kind of gotten away from that discussion. It's either we need more stimulus or we need more tax cuts. Well, we need more people starting things, and in every way, shape, or form. And, I've just given you a fraction of the book, but actually, one reason I'm so optimistic about America, it's the penultimate chapter of the book. It's called They Just Didn't Get the Word. And thank God, America is still full of people who just didn't get the word. They didn't get the word that China's going to eat our lunch, that Germany's going to eat our breakfast, that Brazil's going to eat our dinner. And so they just go out and start stuff and invent stuff and fix stuff. There's actually an explosion of innovation happening around the country. It's not easy. It's harder. It takes risk-taking. But my previous book was on energy and climate, Hot, Flat, and Crowded. And in going around the country talking about that book, it was fascinating to me. I would be inundated at book signings afterwards by energy entrepreneurs. People would come up, Mr. Friedman, I've got a duck, it paddles a wheel, blows up a balloon, issues methane, turns a turbine. I heard the craziest stuff. But it showed me how alive the country still is with innovation and innovators. And I'd go back to my hotel room after events like this. I'd empty my pocket of business cards of energy innovators. Rock stars get room keys. I get business cards. But they're very exciting in their own way, okay? Because they tell me what's down there. You know what I mean? And so the country, that's why, if I had to draw a picture of America today, it'd be a picture of the space shuttle taking off. Space shuttle, all that incredible thrust coming from below. That's all those people down there. And it's happening. And it ain't just in Silicon Valley. But in our case, the booster rocket, Washington, D.C., is cracked and leaking energy, and the pilots in the cockpit are fighting over the flight plan. So right now, the country's got all this energy down there, but it's not being enabled and empowered at the speed, scope, and scale it needs, so we can't get escape velocity to get into the next orbit, to ensure that my generation passes on something close to the American dream. That's the problem, right now. So, and the third thing I'd say is this, and we don't even know how this happens, but here's the education numbers. High school, from the Bureau of Labor Statistics, 60 days ago. People who drop out of high school, official unemployment, 13.7%. People who complete high school, 11%. People who complete 2 years of post-secondary education, 7%. People with 4-year college degrees, 4%, 4.2%. That tells you something. It tells you in this world, the more education you have, the more protection you have against unemployment. Now, I can see from my daughter's friends, my youngest daughter's friends, a lot of them are still in school now, or some are teaching English in Dubai or Korea. They may not be doing what they were trained to do, but they do have jobs, and they are getting skills. Okay? So I know this is not easy. We have to be thinking about this. Of course, that's not what we're doing. We have the president saying he would have killed, bin Laden more times than Romney would have killed him. It's not the kind of conversation we're having right now. This is the only conversation we should be having about this, how we get more people starting things. So we have a whole chapter on that in the book. Thanks for your question. Yeah, please.
Some people say that the next big bubble that's going to burst up, which is bigger than the subprime, is actually education. Mm-hmm. That the great American promise of an Ivy League education guarantees you a great job is not true anymore. When you look at, in today's context, some of the colleges where the biggest employer is Teach America, who gives $30,000 or $35,000, and where university education ends up costing you $60,000, it doesn't total up. What are your views on that?
Sure. I know you're in the education field, so no, I think it's a very appropriate question. Look, there was a bubble around some of these matchbox universities, University of Phoenix and Kaplan and whatnot, where people basically were borrowing money from the government, and the universities would get all the money ahead of time, and then they would get degrees and not get jobs, and that model has blown up. But I don't think, and I think the Ivy League model, clearly, how high can it go? It's now probably close to $60,000 at the top universities for tuition, room, and board for a year. So at some point, it really is, it gets out of all proportion. But that seems to be a small problem. I mean, there's the bubble of, Ivy League universities, how many kids can go to Stanford and how many kids can go to Harvard, and we're not minting anymore with that brand, quality. But I would distinguish between that and education as a bubble. I think education is going to be more important than ever, especially this lifelong learning. The ability to be a lifelong learner is going to matter more than ever. Because when you get change this quick, I started out at the New York Times on a telex machine when I was in Beirut. Just the pure technology of it. So I think there are bubbles, around some of these big brands. There are bubbles around some of the matchbox universities. But I don't think education, per se, would be a bubble at all. Got time for one more. Anybody else? Otherwise, please, yeah.
I'm curious about your analysis. You talk a lot about the efficiency of decision-making in Asia, and particularly in the example tonight in China. And of course, you build a train station or whatever the example was in China in 80 days or 60 days. There's no environmental impact. There's probably no labor laws and so on and so on. So we have this very efficient decision-making model, and we have a bit of it here as well because of the structure of decision-making, which works well in a lot of ways. And in the West, where we have a sense of inefficiency in your train station and your tube station, staircase. How do you resolve those two things?
Yeah, it's a very good question. I'm glad you asked. So, of course, I spoke for 30 minutes about a 450-page book. And the truth is...
It's already on my Kindle.
That's great. The only mention of China in this book is what I read you. Because what we go on to say in the introduction is We wish China well, okay, but we think we have the superior model. We think China has an inferior model, but we do believe China is getting 90% out of an inferior model today, and we're getting 50% out of a superior model. And that the way we talk about China today is really about ourselves. We're talking about what we miss in ourselves, the ability to act collectively, the really ability to do big, hard things together. That's what's been lost in America. And all the challenges we face, those three I laid out, those are big and hard and can only be accomplished together. And so what's happened in America is the system has lost its ability to produce a collective response. So we can only get suboptimal solutions. We become, Frank Fukuyama, I did a column about this 2 weeks ago, calls it a veto-ocracy. We're not a democracy, we're a veto-ocracy because of what's happened. And so as a result, we only produce these really suboptimal solutions. The TARP, for instance. All of this was done, basically on the fly with no due diligence in the middle of a crisis. Well, that's when we come together enough just to do that. And that barely happened, you'll remember. It took 2 votes of the Congress. Because a lot of times people said, well, it'll take a crisis for us to act. We had the crisis. What was 2008? And yet the system is that broken right now, that paralyzed for a lot of complicated reasons which I can't go into tonight. That's what worries me about America. That's why I've been arguing for a third party. And I know in vain, I get that, but in order to change the debate. One of my favorite stories in the book, and I'll end on this, is that, just so I can end on a real downer, is there wine at the table? Okay, is it for those who drink wine? So we quote a guy in the book, one of my favorite quotes from Mike Murphy. He was one of McCain's campaign advisors. Veteran, really wickedly smart guy. And Mike tells a story about when he first got into politics. There was a very wise old ad man who he went to talk about, negative advertising. And this guy said to him, Mike, let me tell you something about negative advertising. Okay? Because Mike said to him, they were talking like, why didn't Burger King ever attack McDonald's? Why didn't Burger King ever say, McDonald's hamburgers have maggots in them? Okay. And this guy said, Mike, because the first rule of advertising is never kill the category. We have killed the category of politics in America just when we need it most. And that's what's wrong right now. And all you have to do is listen to one day of this campaign to know we have killed the category. Have a nice day, and thank you very much for coming. Thank you.